Hi, I'm just sharing this video, which I'll leave the link to it, and a couple of others. And it's Stephen Blackwood is interviewing Jordan Peterson on the cultural inflection point and our cultural inflection point and higher education. And I was introduced by Jordan Peterson by H. Thomas Ackerman, who is an absolutely brilliant guy. I'll leave you a couple of links to his videos under this as well. He's an artist whose work goes beyond the realms of painting pretty pictures. His work is himself, and I do refer to him as a 21st century Van Gogh. So Jordan Peterson is a very, very interesting guy. He's a university lecturer and very, very far ahead in his understanding of the world that we're living in and the consciousness and the history behind that consciousness. So I strongly advise anybody who is attempting to understand the reality of that they're experiencing today to do check out Jordan Peterson's lectures. Now, the purpose of making this video is to focus on the issue of Marxism, which Jordan Peterson very rightly has heavy criticism for, especially in relation to, Marxism being a fundamental cornerstone, as it were, for Soviet communism and the horrors that were inflicted against the people in the name of communism, and communism's adherence to Marxist ideology. Now, as part of my studies, because I did my degree is a CATS degree, a credit accumulation degree. So I started out in history of art, design and film. That was my first year, and that degree looks at human consciousness, the development of society by examining the art, the film and the design of each period of history, mostly going back to the 1700s, though my own personal research, my own studies went a lot further back, and really back to the Gothic period in relation to design, architecture of buildings, artworks, that touch on everything from colonisation to enslavement of African people to the literature of the times, people like William Morris, and just all kinds of influences, so that I was able to understand not just the artifacts that were produced from that period, but the consciousness, the understanding, the thinking, the opinions, the belief, the judgments that led to the creation of those artifacts. Now, in my second year of my degree, I studied gender studies and sociology, and again touching on the art of the periods, but also looking at intensive study of Marxism. And I was quite unpopular among the lecturers on the gender studies because they were mostly women and they were all ardent feminists who found my approach to feminism somewhat antagonistic, because even, despite the fact that I have suffered heavily from male interest in myself as a female human being from childhood, nonetheless I have a humanist approach, you see, in the sense that I very strongly feel that males are equally a victim of the social consciousness that has created a history of oppression against women, allegedly a male oppression, whereas I felt that the male himself was a construct and that he himself is a victim, though he's unaware of it. He's mostly unaware that he's a victim because he's persuaded only to celebrate his privileges, you see. But those privileges are actually as much as, well, they are debilitating the male every bit as much as they are debilitating the female, in the sense that males are not receiving the benefits of a true relationship between the female, because even the female is operating within the gender constructs, and even the reactions of the female to the male construct is in itself part of that oppression. So the rise of the feminist, in a way, is every bit as a part of the female oppression. So they didn't like my humanist approach towards males, and they didn't like my understanding of Marx, because I always, from the very start of studying Marx and Engels, I felt that there was some serious holes in his ideology, in his theory, as it were, and as a direct result of that, the expression of Marxism within Soviet communism, or the Nazi Germany, because don't forget, Nazi Germany was allegedly based on socialism in exactly the same way as Stalinist Russia. Soviet Russia was based on Marxism, and yet noticeably Hitler and Stalin were at odds with each other and fought with each other, you see. So clearly there's a serious problem with Marxism. Now, none of the lecturers appreciated that at all. I was very unpopular among the lecturers. The students actually enjoyed my presentations and would talk to me about it afterwards, but the lecturers were really not happy with me at all, and most disturbingly, they conspired to try and get me actually removed from the course, you know, claiming that, oh, I was so many credits down, saying that I hadn't done an essay, which I actually had. I'd received 68% for this essay, which is quite a reasonable mark, and it was a very difficult period for me in my second year of my degree, my credit accumulation degree, because I'd had to take a year out after completing the first year of history in art, design and film. I had to take a year out because I had this profound supernatural experience, which I've described, about witnessing an event of light being and receiving this message of universal law by an energy of bliss, apparently part of my madness, you know. And not long after that, I started to face the facts of my own suffering, the trauma of the first 17 years of my life, and the amount of abuse I'd suffered, and the judgments that essentially told me that I was the person who was guilty. I mean, one person had even said that I must have committed some very serious crimes in a previous life, and that was why I suffered such levels of abuse. You know, now, me being me, I'm a person who takes such opinions on board, because who am I to question? You know, it's like, well, maybe that is true. You know, maybe that was why the light being showed itself to me, because I'm so evil. And in many respects, perhaps I was, or perhaps I had reached a level of consciousness that allowed me to experience such a communication, because I was able to receive it, and I was strong enough to actually live with it and try to articulate it and share it with the world. Maybe that was why. Maybe it was because I'd survived such traumatic childhood and had such terribly negative experiences from males, and yet still held compassion for males, and still felt love for the male human, okay, and even the female human, because I'd had very negative experiences from females by my own mother and other females that were around me between the ages of 13 and 17 who did facilitate further abuse against myself, and that included rape, okay? And ultimately, it was me who was judged wrong, and I had to live with that. So I'd had to take a year out of university in order to try and deal with all this and work out, have I had some kind of a breakdown? Did I have a psychotic experience? Examining the damages, and then having to address those damages and realise that, yes, that is why most of my life I felt heavily oppressed, and I felt that I've had to try and fit in with the world and work very hard at appearing normal, you see, what passes as normal. Because obviously, if you're not normal, then you're abnormal and you're going to suffer more abuse. So by the time I arrived in the second year, having took a year out, and on the gender studies and studying Marx, I was also simultaneously at that time going through counselling to address the severe abuse and trauma of my childhood and the resulting problems that I was facing in life. I had a very bad stammer. I had to go for hypnotherapy in order to be able to say my name. I had to work out all these judgments that were in my head that were against myself. So I had to find facts and information. Well, facts and information started arriving to me that then challenged these judgments that had been in my brain, in my mind, in my consciousness, judging against me from within. So I had to find the courage, and what gave me the courage was knowledge, was understanding, to cast these thoughts out, and yet simultaneously survive in this world which is continuing to oppress me, you see. So it was a very, very difficult period for me, but nonetheless, I committed to my studies, and as I say, with Marx, I found very serious discrepancies. Now, after leaving university, and my later credits amount to, studies in psychology and person-centred counselling and all that kind of thing. So I went very deeply and studied child psychology because I had to reconnect with my inner child, and human psychology generally, and start to try and I suppose build a picture, a perspective from my phenomenological viewpoint, you see. Now, according to my understanding of Marx, I understand that the guy was what we in the 21st century call a shill, which is basically a voice of controlled opposition, which means that, yes, this person appears to be supporting a particular area of human consciousness in terms of the righteous indignation at being forced to accept the rule of people who are actually behaving criminally towards humanity, but who themselves claim to be justified by God, okay, and by traditional judgments, which I understand as the Babylonian judgments, the mystery judgments against humanity, in the sense that black people were judged inferior, women are judged inferior, animals are judged as non-sentient beings, and blah, blah, and that the male aspect of man is the supreme ruler of earth, and that God is a man, God is a male figure. when, according to my own understanding of reading Genesis and thoroughly understanding the story of Adam and Eve as a parable, explaining how not to be like God, okay? But no, instead we're living according to the parable, and yet quite strangely, nonetheless, accepting the Sabbath day from the God and Goddess who actually created humanity, because obviously it is a God and Goddess, because on the sixth day, after creating the heavens and the earth and the water and this and that, God apparently says, let us create man in our own image, both male and female, to be like us, and set them to tame the earth. So obviously the taming is instinct, isn't it? And obviously that taming includes our own instincts, in the sense of we live by a system of law, because we live in a lawful universe. And if that were not the case, then there would be no earth, there would be no life. There are laws that the universe, the material in the universe operates, and as biological, physical beings, we are part of the material universe, and therefore there are laws created that every human understands according to our conscience and consciousness as to what is right and wrong. So one might understand that it's wrong to rape a child because, you know, a child isn't ready for sexual experience, their bodies are not actually developed sexually yet, and so therefore to impose a sexuality on a child is an imposition. It is a crime, isn't it, to decide, well, you know, I wish to use this child according, because I have some pleasure, some inner desire that makes me want to have sex with children. So instead of questioning why one might have such a desire, instead the instinct is to just satisfy those desires. But apparently, according to God and Goddess who created us, because obviously it is God and Goddess, because why would God say, let us, let us? Who's us? Who is being referred to in Genesis by that word, us? Obviously, God and Goddess, male and female, to be like us, both male and female, that's man, and set them, not him, them, to tame the earth. So there's an equality there right from the start. And yet, very strangely, humanity has decided, yeah, we'll accept, we'll have the Sabbath day, we'll adhere to the Sabbath day from this God and Goddess who created us, but when it comes to actually living on earth, we'll apply as reality. We will totally form our judgment around this parable as presented by the story of Adam and Eve. We will accept that judgments, the judgments that are expressed in that story. We will accept that the woman is inferior, that the man is boss, that the woman is cursed because she menstruates and has to give birth in pain, and that essentially we're all evil and every child is born in original sin. And it's actually the woman's fault that even Jesus died, because we're so evil, and it was her fault. She tempted Adam, when obviously the idea that Eve had tempted Adam, okay, was not accepted by God, was it? Because, you know, if that was a valid form of defence in terms of Adam eating the apple of knowledge, the fruit of knowledge, as it were, if that was truly a valid form of defence, then surely it would have only been Eve who was cast out of the garden, not both of them. Why were both of them? No, because temptation, you see, because right from the start it says in Genesis, you know, tame the earth, tame one's instincts. Adam cannot blame Eve for tempting him. But nonetheless, this idea of temptation continues until the time of Jesus, who explains that, look, when society is following the law, universal law that upholds human rights and equality among races, among the sexes, okay, and it supports a condition of social respect between human to human, then thou shalt not be tempted. Thou shalt not be tempted. You will not be tempted, because you will know for sure, look, if I start doing this, things are going to get really bad. There's going to be a lot of people upset, because you have a conscience, because you're connected to your compassion. This is the driving force within our humanity. It isn't that we feel tempted and we think, no, we're not going to be tempted because we love God so much, because we understand that, oh yes, I really feel sexually attracted to this person, but sorry, that isn't even going to come into the picture, because I actually love my partner, I love my children, I don't want to cause upset and discord between them, I don't want to cause trouble. Or I'm going to think, well, actually, why? Is it because I'm not happy with my partner? No, actually, I'm not happy with my partner. I think if I'm not happy, then my children aren't happy, and I'm living a lie. So I will have to inform my partner that I think it's time that we divorced. I am not happy in this relationship. If the partner's going to say, well, let's move on, let's try and address this, let's work at it, we have children, we have a family, we have a life, blah, blah, blah. Do things humanely, do things with respect, do not deceive, because if, say, as a married woman, I decided to take part in an affair with somebody, then what I've decided to do is to deceive my partner rather than address rather than address the problems in my relationship. I'm choosing to ignore those problems and instead just satisfy my desires and continue in a form of deceit, you see. And it's the deceit and the lies that one has to tell in order to maintain the deceit. All of these things are a crime. They're a crime against my own child's parent. So there are ways of doing things. So that is the idea of temptation. Is that, look, when you're living lawfully and you're living conscientiously and compassionately, there is no temptation. If in a moment of foolishness one is seduced by somebody, by circumstances, by whatever, and then later on you confess that to your partner, that, look, this has happened, and then take, well, maybe we should split up, maybe we should go for counselling. There's a reason. There's always a reason for why we do things, you see. And the reasons for why we are living in this 21st century reality today do relate very strongly to interpretations of Genesis and all kinds of things that were written in the Bible, and then later as an opposition to the religions and the religious tenets that have arisen out of that, and the ways of life that have been imposed on humanity by the misinterpretations of those texts, are then opposed by somebody like Marx, who forms his theory, his philosophy, forming the foundation of Soviet communism and even Hitler's Germany. So, as I say, I looked into Marx and I realised that he was a shill. He was working for the controlled opposition. Now, being already educated according to my first year at university, to studying the history by looking at the context of the individuals and placing them within the context of the psychology of that nation, of that period, then I was able to understand certain things. So looking at Marx, I realised that Marx was suddenly engaged over a course of 10 years of creating his Marxist theory. Immediately after, Britain, the British intelligentsia, people like Byron, Turner, Darwin, had all spoken out in opposition to slavery very strongly, and they actually referred to Jesus and the Bible to support their moral debate against slavery, and they condemned slavery as inhumane and actually criminal. And Darwin himself, who unfortunately people seized on Darwin's theory of evolution to support eugenics that then supported Nazis, okay? Darwin himself loathed the eugenics movement because, as he stated, look, when he was talking about survival of the fittest of the species, he's talking about species, not about individual humans, not about species within a species. And actually, if you were to apply that really to humanity, you would understand instantly that, well, when it comes to nature, it's the females who choose the most suitable sire for their children, you see, for their offspring. The birds will choose the male who can sing the best for their offspring. But when it comes to humanity, females have traditionally had no choice about who's going to sire their offspring, because they have been enslaved by false ideology and false judgments that have condemned them as inferior and actually incapable of making a choice for themselves or having any autonomy. So therefore women have had no say about which males sire their children. And when it comes to humanity, let's face it, being fit has nothing to do with the physical body, does it, really? Fit is in the form of one's intelligence, one's intellect, one's skills. And it really doesn't matter what the person looks like physically. What is important is what is going on in that person's brain, because we are essentially an intellectual species. That is our unique feature of life on our planet. We are the conscious awareness of the life of Earth, aren't we? And like, for example, the story of Noah perfectly exemplifies that, in the sense that being aware and in tune with what's going on and in connection to intelligence, he is aware for some reason, his intuition is in connection to his intuition and higher intelligence, that he is aware that something bad is really going to happen. There's going to be some kind of a flood. And he has faith in his inner knowledge, that his inner perception that tells him this, his inner intuition. He builds an ark and he rescues as many animals as he possibly can, survives the flood, and as a result, also all these animals. So obviously, that is part of our prime function on Earth, isn't it? That we live in a natural universe. Things are going to happen. There's going to be disasters, there's going to be earthquakes, there's going to be floods, and humanity is there as a kind of saving grace, that in saving ourselves, we will also save plants and animals. That's our service, because everything on Earth is here for the advantage. You know, the bees collect their pollen, and at the same time as doing that, as part of their life's instinct and need, they are also performing a service, aren't they, to the natural world. They're feeding, they're pollinating the plants, the trees, they're feeding other animals then get fed as a result of that, and life continues. So you take the bees away, oh, suddenly there's not as much fruit, there's no seeds, oh, suddenly the animals are dying. You know, you take one little thing out of nature and everything starts to collapse. You remove the bees and the food supply has collapsed. You see, this is how life works. Everything, like Einstein says, everything is related, and all things are related, and that includes life on Earth, and that includes human intelligence. So, getting back to the abolishment of slavery in Britain, which I forget right now the exact date, but it was around 1830 something that slavery was abolished in Britain, and then later abolished in all the colonies. Now, I know for a fact that Zionism was in its early stages by that time. This Zionist philosophy of, you know, this set of people are superior, and there's always been a collective consciousness at the top. Now, the collective of consciousness that were in control of Britain by the time of Darwin and Turner and Lord Byron, and you know, members of the general public were voicing severe, absolute condemnation against slavery. At that time, the ruling consciousness had from 1750 onwards removed stolen the common lands of the British people. Don't forget, at that time, 80% of the population was a rural population thriving on common lands, which really formed the peasants' social security, because they grew their own food on those common lands. They kept livestock on those common lands. And it was a peasant population who were also engaged in cottage industries of making things like leather, shoes, fabric for clothing, you know, metalworks, the ironsmith, not just there to create shoes for horses, but also creating tools for farming, gardening, household tools, cutlery, everything was all made through the cottage industries, you see. And then suddenly these machines were developed. Oh, brilliant, brilliant. You don't need to sit in your cottage, spend all your time weaving now. We've got these machines to do it. And so therefore we can produce more, and it means you don't need to do that. It means, oh, you've got more time to spend with your children, more time to farm, more time to learn, more time to enjoy life. No, no, instead, individuals took control of production and then just eradicated the cottage industries, and simultaneously privatised the common lands, because at that time people were very worried about the French Revolution, the nobility of Britain. They'd witnessed what had happened in France, and they decided that, you know, these peasants were a threat and could be at any moment gathered to cause a huge revolution that was going to end in a bloodbath. So it was like the middle classes who were benefiting had grown rich from the factories and the colonisation, the produce of colonisation. They were vying for power. They wanted a political voice, which traditionally only went to the nobility. It was only them who got to vote and take a seat in Parliament and make the decisions for the whole of the nation. And the only way that one could have a vote, well, first one had to be male, and you had to own some land. You had to be a landowner. I mean, later on it went down to be a property owner. So that was how enclosure happened. So the nobility said, well, we aren't going to be selling off the lands of our vast estates, which at the time had all been developed into, gardens that actually reflected the works of Homer and Virgil, the ancient classicist on which neoclassicism itself as a design imposed during the 1750s, where buildings were all suddenly being built according to Roman structures, as it were. Roman architecture suddenly became very fashionable. Although then also that was followed by people like Pugin, who built the Houses of Parliament according to a Gothic kind of design, and it was the Gothic sort of revival of that period, and with it comes your like Romanticism and William Blake and blah blah blah. These are all the influences that were happening at that time, and they were the influences, like for example William Blake, also against slavery, were moving towards a higher consciousness and a more in-depth articulation of our humanity, and even Christianity itself, in the form of what Jesus as an individual really represented, and how that matched with the society that people were then living in, a society that supported the buying and selling of human beings as slaves on the grounds that because of the colour of their skin they weren't actually full human beings, they were inferior human beings, which Darwin, a man like Darwin, questioned and said no, they are full human beings, because if they weren't, then there could be no sexual interrelations and progeny born as a result of that. Obviously they are equal full human beings to white people. And so slavery was abolished. Now, America was very concerned about that, and it was not long after that that America suddenly decided to split from Britain, and it was a real threat because their entire farming industry was actually dependent on black African slaves. So, suddenly there was this problem about a tax on tea. Really, it had nothing to do with that. And suddenly the ruling powers that had robbed the land of British people, robbed them of their industries, left 2 million people to die, ended up with orphanages full of children, and to such a degree that when the first factories are being built, it was the children that were then relied on to man the factories, because there were actually very few adults that were fit enough even to man those factories, and even more, thousands upon thousands of them had been transported to Australia or hung for hunting a rabbit to feed their family. That suddenly became a crime, whereas previously everybody had a right to go and hunt and to gather nuts and berries from the forest, to hunt a rabbit or go and fish a fish. Suddenly all that was abolished. It was banned. It was a crime to go and help yourself to food that's growing freely in nature to feed your family. That suddenly became a crime, punishable by death. So Marxism comes along and, yeah, accepts that, yes, they've taken away the means of production, they controlled the means of production and the proletariat and blah, 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 blah. And it all makes perfect sense. But he does one important thing. He cuts Jesus right out of the picture. Oh, God is the opiate of the masses. And that was where I questioned that man. How dare he say that God and Jesus were the opiate of the masses. How dare he say that? What opiate? What opiate of the masses? How was God and Jesus an opiate of the masses when the whole of that religion fundamentally oppresses women, oppresses children, and allowed for the very structure of society that had stolen our common lands and essentially murdered people through the creation of actually criminal alleged laws? But that I realised later, after I left university and I did more and more studies, I began to realise the man was a shill. He was employed precisely to articulate the very obvious crimes that had been committed by the ruling intelligentsia, the ruling elite, who suddenly were very disturbed that they were challenged and they were forced to abolish slavery on moral and ethical and legal argument that was fully supported by God's law and the morality, the ethics of our humanity. And they had to find a way. They had to find a way to fundamentally cripple that consciousness before it grew. And they did it with Marx. They did it. Cut out Jesus and God as the opiate of the masses. Nietzsche. Nietzsche, I find a very, very misunderstood intellect. Totally misinterpreted. That man obviously understood the reality of higher consciousness, the reality of God, but he also understood the subconscious, the sub-reality, the misinterpretations that had been applied. And really, I find Nietzsche is a criticism of man's response to God, of man's reaction to the concept of God. But the intelligentsia, the ruling elites of the time, I mean, you can't really call them intelligentsia because it was Darwin and Byron and Turner and William Blake who were the intelligentsia, the mass of people who stood against slavery who were the intelligentsia, but the ruling elite who considered themselves superior, they chose to misinterpret Nietzsche. It was easy for them to misinterpret Nietzsche and to create their Nazism out of it. It was very easy for the Russians to actually fully implement Marxist ideology and cut Jesus out. Yes, we don't need compassion because we're talking about rationality and logic here. The state controls everything. So, as far as I'm aware, Marx was a shill and he was employed exactly to articulate the obvious reality, the crimes that had been committed against the people in robbing them of their income. And people say, oh, well, it was a necessity because new technology had come along, so yeah, they lost their jobs. Oh, but that didn't happen in Germany, did it? The Germanic states that were collectively a mini EU within Europe at the time. That is what they amounted to, a mini EU, all interrelated, intertrading. And right from the start of the German Industrial Revolution, which happened a bit later than the British Industrial Revolution, right from the start, the majority of the Germanic Empire's factories were state-owned and controlled, and they took steps to ensure that those factories did not compete with the cottage workers' industries. And as a result of that, by the beginning of the 20th century, Germany had emerged as a superpower. They had the best technology because the government had invested in producing the best technology. They, at the same time, their cottage industries were flourishing and were prized and treasured throughout the world as the best workmanship available. So there was Germany, the Germanic states, as a shining example that brought Britain to shame, because Britain's population, by comparison to the German population of the same period, was in a very sorry state. The majority of people had rickets, people were living in slums, people were living in squalor, they were uneducated. The Germans, by comparison, were very healthy, very strong, educated. Oh, suddenly, Germany becomes an evil place. You know, there's attack after attack after attack till, you know, the First World War. Because again, word was passing through. Word was getting through to the people on the ground. People were saying, oh, but look at Germany. They got fantastic industry. And you know, they didn't rob the people of the common land. They didn't destroy the cottage industries. Look how well they're doing. This consciousness has been operating for a very, 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 very long time, and it looks ahead and it notices and it picks its people. And I tell you now, Marx was a shill, and he was employed to do exactly what it did. It took him 10 years to write his madness that was specifically to remove the core component out, the human being, which is what Jesus represents, the human male, the true human male, the true law. And hats off to Jordan Peterson. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, because I have no time for Marx. I have no time for Marxist ideology. As far as I'm concerned, he steals the truth, the reality, the suffering that people have lived and turns it into his ridiculous theory that then cuts out the very humanity that was oppressed. So, yeah. Thank you for taking time to listen. It's only half the length of Jordan Peterson's video, but what can I say? These things are so important, and we need to abandon Marx. Marx needs to be abandoned for the shill that he was. That is what he was, a shill. The reality that forms his theory belongs to the people of the era from which he came. It is not his. He does not own the reality of the cottage industry worker that was robbed of his income, that was robbed of his common land, that was hung for hunting a rabbit to feed his children, and the children who ended up in an orphanage and then working in a factory with no parents, with no family. This forms the basis, the foundation of the workforce, the army that later was sent to be slaughtered in the trenches of World War I and then later World War II. This was the foundation of the British workforce consciousness. So Marx, as far as I'm concerned, has a lot to answer for. I do believe that he was paid, he was recruited specifically to create his Marxist theory, and that was then deliberately applied to Russia and to, you know, I'm not saying the Tsar was perfect, of course none of them were perfect, but it's the manner in which things are done and the time in which things are done. That just at the time that the Tsar is questioning the Rothschilds' banking system, oh, suddenly he's gone and the whole of Russia is now a Marxist, allegedly serving Marxist theory. And that is when the full reality of exactly why Marx was employed to create his theory comes into play. So, anyway, that is my understanding of it. And as far as I'm concerned, Marx delivered a heavy blow to the very idea of socialism before people had even started calling it socialism. Germany was operating socially. It was a socio-capitalist society. So it was state-controlled, largely state-controlled, not totally. There were privately owned factories and industries, but it was a socio-capitalist society. Before that concept had ever really come to the fore in people's minds, that before that label could be applied, that, oh, this is socialism, that is capitalism, we can see socio-capitalism works. And this division, as I've been constantly explaining, between the socialist and the capitalist, it's a totally false division. It's the same as the division between male and female. How can we survive with the male and female constantly? Either one's a slave and the other's dominant. How can we survive as a social species if we're going to just submit totally to the rules of a competition, and there you go. Oh, sorry, you lost the competition. Stop grumbling. That you did get no healthcare. You get no hope. You get no education. You don't get enough food to eat, and neither do your children. And this idea of the child as a minor human being, does Marx address that? No, no, no. So either he was a shill or he was deeply, deeply flawed by the conditioning and programming of the very times in which he was born. And Marxism needs to be utterly discarded. Because it's antiquated. It's antiquated. It's coming from an antiquated consciousness. And as I say, he has stolen. As far as I was concerned, he just simply came along and intellectualised, like Chomsky does today, intellectualises the suffering of humanity as if it's his own, and he gets celebrated and applauded for saying exactly what the people who are living it already know. But nobody's listening to us. Oh no, they're all listening to Chomsky. There you go. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for taking time to listen. Thank you again, Jordan Peterson and Stephen Blackwood, for this wonderful interview. Thank you, H. Thomas Ackerman, for introducing me to some sense and sanity in this world.